And we were creating this amazing people who would take on a whole life and purpose of their own. And they were very powerful. I mean, the fur trade, they held the prairies for a good part of the 19th century, some of the best warriors that this country produced. I mean, Gabriel Dumont, probably the most interesting strategist among the military figures we produced. And then suddenly around the late 19th century, you just felt it all flipping. And suddenly, you know, being Metis was a negative, and it was weak. You know, read the text. It's all about the two, you know, it's racist mathematics. It's always fascinating because it doesn't make any sense. You have to laugh at it. Otherwise, you take it seriously and you're in deep trouble. And, you know, it's you take one First Nations and one white person, you put them together, and they produce a child, and the result is a half-breed, right? Half-breed. So 1 + 1 = a half. That's classic racist math. Classic, right? So it's all turning it around. Well, of course, the reality is, what was happening was, you know, take the Hudson's Bay Company. The ships go north, they stop in the islands on the northwest coast, they pick up some young men who have no money, almost no education, no land, no family contacts. They hardly speak English because they actually spoke Gaelic and they're no longer speaking that, so it's their second language. So they're nobodies from nowhere. They're boys on the make. But they've obviously got some talent. They've got courage. They've got some smarts. They're the kind of people, they're good immigrants, right? They got edge. And they arrive, and they got instructions, unwritten instructions for hundreds of years, that what they ought to do as soon as they get to where they're supposed to be is they ought to try to negotiate a marriage with a daughter of a chief. Why? Well, because by getting that marriage, you're going to marry somebody who will make sure you eat well, that you dress properly, that you live comfortably. You're going to marry into a military and commercial empire or confederation or federation. So in other words, what was happening was that the immigrants who married First Nations were marrying up. Once you realize that the Europeans were marrying up by marrying Aboriginals, that it was social promotion to marry Aboriginal, then you understand the roots of the country properly. Which is to say, who had the power, who had the understanding, who knew where we were, who knew what we were doing. You needed to marry up. So it was a classic case of smart young guys doing well for themselves by marrying into good families. Novels have been written about this. You know, it's classic European sociology. You know, if you're a poor young man with some brains and some courage, you marry up. And that created, in a sense, the way in which Canada would be put together. So then, as we know, at the end of the century, there was this appalling collapse in the First Nations Aboriginal population from 2 million still around 1850, still around 2 million, collapsing down to around 175,000 in around 1910, in fact. I mean, a real low point, just appalling because of disease, because of the breakup of the hunting systems and so on. And, you know, the beginning of that idea, well, they're disappearing, so let's help them along the way by turning them into us, sort of thing. A real betrayal of a conversation, a rewriting of history, and erasing with a great precision of First Nations and Metis from the history of Canada. And of course it came along, it wasn't alone, it was the time, it was that appalling high point of the empire mentality, of the racism of the empire mentality, which led to the head tax, and what happened to the Japanese during the Second World War, and what happened to the Sikhs, and so on. So, you know, basically you could say we had 100 very bad years from the point of view of human relationships and memory. I mean, good things happened in that period. But, you know, 1870, 1970, 1850, 1950, I mean, it's sort of a century of denial of what was most interesting about us. I'm not saying it was a total denial, I'm not saying it was a total disaster. Some really good things happened in that period, but really from the point of view of remembering where we'd come from and having an idea of what that all meant, we lost track. And it was a really quite dangerous and costly period for us, and as a result, we almost broke up several times. You know, the conscription riots, they were very difficult to keep the country going while we were forgetting who we were. But the interesting thing is that the conversation, the old conversation, which is the roots, or are the roots, is the roots of the country, that conversation continued on among Aboriginals. They didn't forget. One of the interesting things about oral culture and oral memory is it's far better at remembering. I mean, that's what Delgama, the Supreme Court decision is about. That actually oral memory is more accurate than written memory, because it's harder to actually rewrite oral memory. Whereas it's actually very easy, as people like Stalin proved, to rewrite written memory. And that's, it can be done quite easily. You just sort of get somebody to come in and rewrite it. Whereas when you have a publicly shared oral memory, it's pretty solid and it's pretty specific. And so it's stood the test of time, as our courts have agreed in case after case over the last 25 years. So in this memorandum of the BC chiefs to Wilfrid Laurier in 1910, basically in Kamloops, there's another quote. I just think it's worth giving you. Quote, these people, i.e. the newcomers, these people wish to be partners with us in our country. We must therefore be the same as brothers to them and live as one family. Listen to this. You want to understand single-tier health care? You want to understand Canadian social policy at its best? You want to understand transfer payments and the roots of it? Listen. What is ours will be theirs, and what is theirs will be ours. We will help each other to be great and good. 1910. Shuswap. Pretty fabulous. Wouldn't you like those to be your roots? Would you really prefer to have the guys who brought you the Holocaust and the First World War to be your roots? I mean, there's a choice here. There's a choice. And this is the roots of what makes this country interesting. It makes it special. It makes it a fair place, egalitarian place. And what's more, these are elegant ideas. They're sophisticated. And they're not ideas of absolutes. You'll notice that one of the things that's totally non-European there is the absence of the idea of absolute ownership, which is such a barbaric idea. I know you want to own your house. I realize that. But the whole concept of how a civilization works, and you say to yourself, how come we have so much crown land? How come we have so many parks? How come we have all these systems which are not based, for example, actually reserves, including that, which are not based on the individual owning their land? Where does that come from? Certainly not a European idea. Certainly not an English or a French idea. So where did it come from? What are the roots of it? But even though over the last few decades we've seen, since the Second World War, the gradual removal of the worst of those racisms of the high empire period, we've seen really increasing attempts by ourselves to think of ourselves in a different way, for example, as an immigrant civilization, to try and work on that. But it has to be said that even though we're getting better at it, that the blockage from the point of view of what is the role, what is the importance, what are the rights of Aboriginal peoples, it's still a terrible blockage. I still see the signs of it. I mean, sure, we've made great progress, but most of the progress is being made because the Aboriginal peoples are working day and night, 7 days a week to make it happen. It's not because of any real initiatives coming from the other parts of the population. And our governments, our departments are still really blocking the way as if they were serving our interests when they're actually not serving our interests at all. And what I've always been impressed by as I read what was said and is said by Aboriginal leaders over this period of time is this continuing elegance and sophistication. I mean, I'm not sure, I know about the problems. I know the list of problems, and if there are Aboriginals in the audience, they could stand up and give the list of problems just as well as anybody else could. But what's interesting is if you follow the main line, the main discourse, you could follow the main discourse of Canadian prime ministers, of Canadian historians and philosophers. Follow the main discourse coming out of the Aboriginal communities, nations. It's the elegance of it and the kind of calm patience. We'll wait. This will work out in the end. And for example, Grand Chief John Kelly in the 1970s, testifying in public, as the years go by, the circle of the Ojibwe gets bigger and bigger. Canadians of all colors and religions are entering that circle. You might feel that you have roots somewhere else, but in reality, you are right here with us.